Hello and welcome to another adventure in Georgian literature. So, as I said last time I saw you, that we are having a look at some essays, some journalism from Dr. Johnson. But before we start there, remember, if you want to support us, there is our shop where we have books and writing services. There is also our Redbubble shop where we have over 100 designs. So both of those are ways that you can support the channel. If you would like to support us but don't want to spend any money, that's fine. Like, subscribe, share, comment, all of those things help support the channel. So, what are we having a look at? Well, we have our big Samuel Johnson, and I said last time that we were going to have a look at his essays, his short pieces. In particular, we're having a look at the Rambler essays, also some essays from the Idler and the Adventurer, basically the essays that were in here. So Dr. Johnson wrote these essays. There are many essays. The essays for the Rambler alone are 208 essays. They were bi-weekly, so twice a week. He would put out an edition of the Rambler. This writing comes from the same time when Dr. Johnson is writing the dictionary. Of course, the dictionary took 8 years to write, so he was obviously doing some things, but it was a huge job doing the dictionary. And then he's also writing 2 essays a week. Now, these essays are very much, the title, The Rambler, is very pertinent because they are essays across all sorts of different ideas, different themes. Sometimes the essays would, there would be multiple essays on the same theme. I think there's about 3 essays on marriage in here. And they speak to, it's not just interesting based on, well, what did Dr. Johnson think about this? Or at the time, he was just Mr. Samuel Johnson. He wasn't doctor yet. He hadn't finished the dictionary. But it's not just what did Samuel Johnson think about these things. What's interesting in it is, what are the debates? What is the public discourse at the time that Samuel Johnson was writing these pieces? What sorts of things were sparking debate, sparking conversation? So they are interesting from the literary perspective of the works of Samuel Johnson, but they're also interesting from a historical perspective in terms of what were ordinary people ignited by and interested in. Now, the Rambler had a subscription of 500 subscribers, which is more or less how you sold books or sold things in those days. You actually had a subscriber list, and they put in the money ahead of time and got the book at the end. So the modern concept of royalties had not yet properly developed. It was in there, but the subscriber model was another model of publication that was being used. He had a 500 subscriber list, and if you only look at the 500 subscriber list, the Rambler doesn't look like it's a massive roaring success. However, getting a hold of any of those 208 original Rambler essays is well nigh impossible. There are hardly any of them left because they were read to death. These essays were picked up by provincial periodicals and republished without permission, pirated copies. They were influential far beyond their 500 subscriber base. So the essays started to get put into book form before the full 208 essays were finished. These essays, not only did they get picked, people were interested in them, but also they were so interested in them, they wanted a permanent copy of them, a copy that they could put in their library. So these give an idea about the appetite of 18th century English people for contemporary thought of, and we are talking an educated class, not these are not things necessarily read by working class people. These are, because literacy hasn't yet seeped down that far, but literacy is, the 18th century sees a boon in literacy that is really striking. People are reading, and they are reading a lot, and they're reading all sorts of things, from novels to pamphlets to the beginnings of biography. They're reading poetry. They're reading lots and lots and lots of things. And that's what makes these essays quite interesting. I was particularly interested in his essays that were discussing literary themes, because it's very interesting to see at this early stage of how novels are, of the production of novels, how they're being negotiated in the world. So from Johnson, and we saw this with his preface from Shakespeare, he believes that novels should be somewhat ennobling and show virtue. Of course, this is now the 18th century, not the 17th century. The 17th century has saw massive wars of religion and massive upheaval, massive violence, and it is interesting that the topics by the 18th century, what people are turning to talk about. People aren't talking about religion anymore. They don't want to talk about religion. Arguing about religion has just... No, we do not want to do that anymore. That is traumatizing and awful. We're going to discuss books. We're going to discuss books and other miscellaneous things. We're going to just talk about this. So when Johnson is talking about virtue, he's not talking about virtue in relation to a particular religious creed. He is merely talking about a rather nebulous concept of good and bad, and, you know, more proper conduct than a moral thing, although he may use that language. So at this point in the novel, we already have seen earlier in the century, Swift having a go at Daniel Defoe being very popular with his novels. But by the mid-18th century, you have things like Clarissa, you have things like Pamela, you have things like Tom Jones. And especially with something like Clarissa, with its incredibly suave and seductive villain, you have Johnson talking about it's probably not a good thing, given that it's young people who read these things, to have someone who is a seducer and a rake being held up as so appealing that he would like to see villains look like villains. He would much prefer a trad Richard III to a seductive rake like, what's his name? Lovelace. I haven't read Clarissa. It's 1,000 pages long. I'm not reading it. And I don't like Richardson. So, but I think it's Lovelace is the villain. He's a rake. He's terrible, but he's so seductive. He's like your bad boy. And so here we have people are debating, is this good for our young people to be reading? These are debates that we have today. We have still not settled whether or not it is a good thing for people to read bad characters or not. Is it cathartic or is it a bad influence? We are still talking about this. It's very interesting looking at him discussing biography, which is quite a new genre, and autobiography. And he comes down on the concept that an autobiography is more honest than a biography, because a biography will either be written by a friend or an enemy who will reduce your bad parts or increase them depending on how they feel about you. He sees autobiography as more trustworthy from that perspective. But how many of us have read politicians' autobiographies and gone, wow, deluded much? So it is quite interesting. We would not necessarily see autobiography as 100%. You have to take it with a grain of salt. There's always a lot of personal myth making when it comes to autobiography. Another essay that I thought was quite interesting was the concept of imitation, and young writers imitating older writers, and instead of pursuing their own original ideas. And that made me think there's a lot about the 18th century that I think is somewhat similar to what we have now, which is really weird because you would think, oh, but that's so long ago. But I find the 19th century is so much more boring than the 18th century. I think that the 18th century and this sudden rise in the book trade, the testing the waters, the seeing exactly what is possible, what is not possible, the pushing the boundaries, the experimenting with genres, is much more like us today with the internet than we are like the 19th century. The 19th century is much more codifying. Oh, this is the high stuff for the wealthy, but we'll just make cheap stuff for the poor. There doesn't seem to be quite that demarcation. If you could read and you could get a hold of it, it wasn't off limits. Whereas the 19th century feels more know your place. I find that the 18th century's just the possibility that seems that you see in writing and book selling and what people were doing in the 18th century is much more interesting than the 19th. But it also makes me think about today, where we have the internet. The internet is, it's within my lifetime. So let's go with 1995. So is about when things started getting into the hands of ordinary people. Yes, it was a pretty rough start at the beginning. It was pretty much wall-to-wall adult content. Didn't matter what you put into the internet, you got adult content. Back in those wild, wild west days. But now that we are, 20, nearly 30 years from then, it is sort of settling into, well, this is what we do with it. This is how we use it. And we are still negotiating that. How much are we negotiating? What can you talk about? What can't you talk about? What are the limits of what you can say on the internet? How much of this is controlled by big money? How much are you able to do on a smaller scale? these are all really interesting questions that we are asking now, and they are looking at it themselves in the 18th century with the printing presses. Okay? I mean, weekly YouTube videos talking about books is very much in the vein of something like the Rambler. They have to be thought up, they have to be executed, they have to be disseminated. It's a very similar vibe. So I find that quality of the 18th century really, really fascinating. Also, it's a time when women are writing. Women are able to get their writing out there, and they're not just... The 19th century seemed to close a lot of that down a lot more than was in the 18th century. Women were publishing under their names. They weren't just publishing as a lady, a la Jane Austen. But by the 19th century, you start getting that, you know, a lady under a man's name, these sorts of things, which seems to be a bit less of an issue earlier, in the earlier period, and I think that that's kind of fun to think about. Also, talking about imitation made me think about the fact that he's talking about people don't have original ideas, and then it makes me think about, well, how much when something gets really big and everyone makes a video on it and they get a lot of attention, and then it gets forgotten almost instantly. That rapid turnover of content. The 18th century, those writers were creating an awful lot of content because there was an audience that wanted the content. 208 essays while you're trying to write a dictionary is a lot of content. It's a lot of putting out your ideas about a thing. Very much. And partly the reason why writers wrote these little things, is because you didn't get paid a lot for your writing. So you're writing high volumes to get paid, to make money. I mean, Johnson did not have any level of financial security until after the success of the dictionary, and he received a pension from George III. He received a yearly pension. He is not living in a world where he has like secure employment. He is a jobbing writer. He is doing things here and there and all over the place, all sorts of patchy things. The dictionary itself was a thing that he was doing on commission, not because he wanted to write a dictionary, but because somebody was going to pay him. So I think that is really, really interesting. The other essay that I found really interesting were the ones on pastoral poetry. And they made me think about the concept of cottagecore and the romanticization of the countryside, which is entirely what pastoral poetry is. And Johnson talking about the fact that pastoral poetry is incredibly constructed, that you put courtiers' words into the mouths of shepherds and shepherdesses, that it is at the same time that it is escapist literature, that it is a thing that we use to escape, like fantasy writing. Fantasy writing is effectively like pastoral poetry was. He suggests that pastoral poetry has lots of options, whereas maritime it would not. That you just can't. There isn't enough you can do by the coast, and I think partly this is because pastoral poetry has a very, very ancient pedigree. It goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks says, like, what stress could you have that you want to run away and become a shepherdess? But it is an incredibly ancient thing. Apparently, it seems that you put human beings into an urban setting and they'll dream about being subsistence farmers in the country. dream about, not actually do. Are you kidding? It's been raining for a week and it's cold. I don't want to go out and deal with animals. I'll sit back and watch my cute shows in peace, thank you very much. And that's what pastoral poetry is. It's been raining for a week. I'm going to sit by the fire and I'm going to read this and imagine myself in a different place where it's always sunny and it's always lovely. It's like Demeter's paradise. So I think it is interesting how, looking at the 18th century, people understood, and someone like Johnson, who had a great mind, certainly understood, this is escapist, this isn't real, why are we doing this? And they're asking those questions and they're talking about those things. These are things we still grapple with. When is it escapist and when does it start to become problematic? When is imitation learning and when is imitation just, producing bags of content that are a waste of everybody's time? They're very, very fascinating little essays, and that's just the ones on literature, and that's just the ones in the book. So there are 208. So if you are interested in looking for them, I'm sure they're somewhere. They might be on Project Gutenberg. If they are, I'll put a link down below to the Rambler essays. But they are a fascinating glimpse into the world of middle-class reading and middle-class concerns of the 18th century. They are a lot more like us than we honestly would think, in spite of the fact that their fashion not at all like us. I enjoy the 18th century because we do have similarities, far more than you see in the 19th century. So that's Dr. Johnson's periodical essays. Next time, now I'm going to give you two options because I don't know which one I'm going to be able to do. What I would like to do is Gulliver's Travels, but I'm waiting on a copy of the book because apparently it's really hard to get a copy that isn't a children's copy, and I'm still waiting on that book. If that arrives in time, I will do Gulliver's Travels. If it hasn't arrived, we'll do the Dunciad, Alexander Pope. So either we're going to get the remake of the Gulliver's Travels video, or we're going to have a look at Alexander Pope's Dunciad. I will get someone to let you know as soon as we know and put up a short. So until then, farewell. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.